Before Silicon Valley ever dreamed of AI utopias, there was a real political movement in the 1930s that wanted to abolish democracy and replace it with an engineer-run state, complete with energy cards and gray uniforms. Welcome to the Rabble Report. I'm Grant.
I'm Joe.
And I'm Anton.
Anton, welcome back to the show. You described this movement of technocracy in the 1930s in your recent article in Novum, Welcome to the Technocracy. For people who've never heard of these technocrats and Howard Scott, and I was one of those people, can you sketch what this movement was and how seriously it was actually taken at its peak?
Yeah, so technocracy is kind of a movement that's been largely forgotten in the American public imagination. It reached its peak around 1933. And around that time, major newspapers were calling it the most talked about topic in America. And what's odd about it is that it fizzled out relatively quickly, almost as quickly as it blew up. Around 1933, there was estimated around 250,000 members. And these were spread out across the country in many different chapters, largely based in California. And it really blew up in 1933 after its founder, Howard Scott, had a disaster of a radio appearance. And from then on, he was grilled in the papers, and it just fizzled into obscurity.
What did they believe in? What did they advocate for?
Yeah, so they emerged from like an interesting trajectory that's really neither left or right. Basically, in the throes of the Great Depression, they became incredibly popular because they put forward a criticism of capitalism, which argued that the price system was inherently causing waste and would ruin the American public further. And so they proposed a new anti-democratic state, essentially run entirely by engineers. And these engineers would be had backgrounds in science and major industry, and they would essentially be responsible for running the whole logistical system of the United States, distributing goods, managing inputs and outputs, and running America essentially like a well-oiled machine. That was their goal.
So, Anton, who was Howard Scott? Was he left-wing or right-wing to you?
Yeah, so Howard Scott, he was the one that really pushed Technocracy Incorporated when it was at its height. But his origins are really strange. So he himself, despite claiming he had scientific credentials, pretty much fabricated everything. He was a familiar face in Greenwich Village from the early 20s to the early 30s, and pretty much stood on a soapbox and tried to explain to people and convince people of his vision for a world run by engineers and technocrats. And as somebody who really, he was more like a salesman than any sort of scientist. And what's interesting about technocracy movement is that really it's sold and peddled in dreams. And so they liked having mass rallies. They even had an aesthetic look to them. They wore gray suits and had like gray cars, and were very proactive in spreading pamphlets. And so the technocracy movement really was like fused with like aesthetic and more like persuasive and rhetorical like flair than any sort of scientific argument. And that's why the media was so ruthless when they discovered that Scott had no credentials. They basically destroyed his whole reputation. But before that, he was able to procure funding and support from actual scientists and sci-fi writers and artists, everybody who gave in to his dream, basically, because he was such a good salesman of technocracy.
Do you think that this was a mass movement? Or maybe we should define what a mass movement is, because I think we've talked about this a bit before, but what is the difference between mass politics in general at the time and how politics works today?
Yeah, I think you guys have covered a lot of this in your previous episodes, especially like mass politics today in particular. But back then in the 30s, you had to sell your political vision by appealing to the mass. Like you couldn't get around it. Like even though technocracy was an elite theory, still Howard Scott had to hold these large rallies. He had to have like, small committees throughout the country. He had to have chapters, very populist type energy going, because he was competing with the New Deal. He was competing with politics that was very mass oriented. So technocracy, even though it was elitist, also took on mass forms. And nowadays, it seems kind of strange that why would an elite theory argue for mass politics, but that's how they tried to sell it to everyday people. And that's how they were able to get so many members in such a short amount of time.
Right. I mean, to your point too about them competing with other groups, it situates us in the time frame, right? The political parties at the time had social ties to churches, unions, all sorts of actual institutions that people participated in their daily lives. And so politics had this different relationship to representation and social groups.
They openly campaigned against democracy, but they did it in a way that was like mass political, which is kind of funny now looking backward.
Do you think that they were promising to represent you, just not democratically? Or do you think it's something else?
Well, they did organize. So if you look at like the way they organized what they called the Technate. So the Technate was Technocracy Incorporated. It's kind of a funny thing to, it's kind of a funny term because it sounds like something out of sci-fi, but it's actually what they proposed as a whole organizing state that would run through the entire North American continent, Mexico, Canada, and the United States. And it would essentially be a committee of a centralized committee that would on paper represent the people. And really in the eyes of the technocracy movement, they viewed technology as really the only revolutionary agent. So they didn't really value, like the public was only valuable insofar as they were properly fed, properly clothed, given material things. They weren't really looking, like they didn't consider representation to be a major prerogative in that sense, in the way we understand it, like democratic representation.
So who is technocracy for then? Why do any of this in the eyes of its founders? I mean, why do you want to make capitalism more rational, and for whose benefit?
I guess they considered, well, I mean, I guess two things mainly is that they came from a tradition of anti-capitalism, and so they viewed capitalism as having a lot of waste. And really it was, technocracy was like a way to argue that there's more potential, like industrial potential. We could go further than we're going. Like capitalism is actually an obstacle to scientific progress. Like we should be going faster than we're going. We should accelerate more. So they basically thought that capitalism was keeping us tethered to stagnation or something like that, right? And the second thing, who is it for, is Jay genuinely believed, as the way they sold it through their pamphlets, that material abundance was right around the corner. Like this was a time of modernism. People thought technologically we could produce like a Garden of Eden type situation if only we let the technological forces like run wild.
And you mentioned they come from an anti-capitalist tradition. I'm just curious, what did they want to replace capitalism with exactly? And I know you're mentioning this engineer state, but how would products circulate, for example?
Yeah, so they had like a strange system for distributing goods. So essentially, if you read the original Technocracy documents, essentially it would be organized on a system of energy accounting. So the way Howard Scott and the other technocrats imagined this in the 30s was that currency would be replaced by energy distribution cards. And so every good would be tallied based on how much energy it consumes. And then a new calendar was proposed for uninterrupted production. And so essentially like currency was energy basically. And in a very industrial kind of mindset, they valued everything relative to how much it cost, and energy was just seen as like this like natural fit. And it kind of bears a lot of resemblance to like arguments from the 1910s about distribution quotients and like stuff that was floating around in like left-wing circles. But this was more of a attempt to like tally everything mathematically so that you could, you know, have inputs, outputs, like very systematized.
So how much was Howard Scott influenced by socialism versus having his own idiosyncratic views? Because looking at his thinking and his background, it looks like he took influence from socialism, but removed society from the equation.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much spot on. I mean, before Technocracy Incorporated, Scott was involved in a group called the Technical Alliance, and that group did have some socialists in it. And the Technical Alliance was formed in 1919, and essentially one of their early works, like one of the early projects, was discovering what was the waste in capitalism, and that formed a lot of their criticism of capitalism. And through that alliance, that organization, Scott met a lot of workers and activists associated with the IWW, which was a radical union, far left union in America. And so there was some overlap, but pretty much by the time Scott started the Technocracy Incorporated movement proper, those leftist elements were pretty much stripped out of it. There was no social, like left-wing labor component anymore.
Actually, Joe, I'm curious if you could elaborate on what you mean by taking society out of it. I think that's an interesting point.
I guess the promise of early 20th century socialist politics was the idea of society running things as sort of cooperative commonwealth, especially the working class. Whereas for Howard Scott, he's positing a sort of elite cadre of engineers to run society and unleash its potential.
It's kind of funny because a lot of the socialist states of the mid 20th century kind of turned into a cadre of engineers trying to manage society.
It is actually profoundly political when you think of it in that sense.
Right. You would need a political class of engineers. It wouldn't actually have that apolitical quality that I think there is an anti-political pull here. I think that's part of why it had resonance, is this idea of taking the politicians out of it. But you sort of just end up with new politicians who have engineering degrees, or in Scott's case, don't actually.
Yeah, I think one of the underlying like philosophy behind technocracy movement also was this belief that there was like a social Darwinist element too, like superior people deserve to be in the state, and we know who's superior because they can run industry, they can, you know, engineer, you know, society, they have specific technical expertise. And so like obviously at this time there wasn't a lot of possibility for automation completely, and computers were still in a very early infancy type stage. But from what I've gathered, technocracy never aspired, at least the way Scott imagined it, technocracy from the 30s never aspired to replace humans with machines. They still wanted humans there. Like they were still in a way, like they were like, they recognized that if we take humans out of the equation, we're just going to be victims to forces we can't control. So they were very like, they were privy to like the political component of it. You know what I mean?
When is somebody going to come along and propose a fully AI state?
It's definitely more feasible now than it was then.
And that does seem like something that I guess the newer technocrats that you talk about, the tech elites in your article, talk about.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you guys that question too, because I felt like a lot of the thoughts that were, you know, the philosophy that was underlying the technocracy movement has been unconsciously revived by a lot of tech elites today, especially this belief in technology being a revolutionary force, this idea that you can run society like inputs and outputs, also this anti-democratic kind of element to today's tech elites. And so although they're not directly, reading text from the technocracy movement, I do feel like some of their ideas have been revived. And I was wondering if what you guys' assessment is on that. Do you think some of these ideas are gaining new resonance today?
I have to wonder if it's a smokescreen. I thought one of the comments on your article was pretty insightful, actually, on this. Basically, I do wonder if there's sort of like neo-technocratic, anti-democratic babble for a lot of these ideologues in the tech world is sort of a front for an economic sector that is reliant on the state so heavily and over time is increasingly drawn into it. And that's sort of the irony of it, really. Because at first, I mean, a lot of what's driven the tech world or a lot of what drove the tech world's ascent in the last 20 years has been low interest rates, for one, and then this AI bubble. This AI bubble, I think, is like how they've kind of compensated for the end of 0% interest rates and selling themselves to the state in a new partnership, especially with defense.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to that, because if you look at how many tech elites jumped ship from Biden to Trump when the election came, it really shows how joined at the hip they are to state money. Because they know if they're not politically on the right side, they're basically screwed. So they all coalesce around Trump so quickly, like as bandwagoners, basically.
We've been saying that he's not left-wing. Howard Scott does have a quote, and I think he's just being provocative here, but he said, as far as technocracy's ideas are concerned, we're so far left that we make communism look bourgeois.
What a troll. That guy's a troll, let's face it.
Yeah, I think that's him being a good salesman.
What does he mean by that, do you think? Is he talking about technocracy as anti-capitalist? He's talking about it as social progress?
Well, he criticized communism as not radical enough because the socialist countries still used a price system.
And he probably would have some allies in like the Soviet Union in the most like radical segments, maybe.
There are a lot of communists that still think this way, actually. I mean, not a lot of communists, but like there's not
a lot of communists extant.
Fair enough. What I was trying to like get at too is like, who's supposed to be in the driver's seat of all this?
Yeah.
That seems a little bit more important to me than like, well, they want to manage an ideal system, but it kind of, I think the thing is you could run a zoo like this. And I don't know, should society be run like a zoo? Are we zoo animals?
Oh, run like a zoo?
Yeah.
I mean, I guess that's a good comparison. It's kind of what they want to do.
Right. I feel like this is actually like this does get at a lot of how politics sees itself now, even really.
Yeah, they're even outside of any kind of explicit technocracy movement. There is a turn in politics, especially as politics became less socially rooted towards the end of the 20th century, lost their social bases, towards trying to understand and manage people through demographics and party branding and messaging that's hyper segmented and targeted to different demographics is going to win you elections or things like that. Or that social problems can be resolved technocratically.
Right. And even Mir gets at this too, because he talks about
Peter
how, Peter Mir, our Peter Mir, for our listeners who've been following us faithfully for every episode. But he talks about this, he talks about how policymaking has been increasingly outsourced. Policymaking has increasingly devolved to nonpartisan commissions and agencies. Yet a lot of policy is written by think tanks, not even within the state.
There's been a lot of discussion on how much how states run today, how states are run today, whether or not they could be classified as technocracies. So you have China, for example, which is commonly called a technocracy. Arguably, the Soviet Union could be called a technocracy. And then you have the European Union, which functions in a bureaucratic web of claimed expertise. And I'm not sure I would classify it as being run by engineers, but it definitely has a technocratic mentality in the sense of managing society in a very inputs, outputs kind of way. I wouldn't classify the US as a technocracy, but there's definitely factions within the state that would prefer that outcome, or maybe they view that system as enriching for themselves because they would be the ones getting the contracts for it and stuff like that. So there's definitely different strains of technocracy in the air now that are competing or maybe bouncing off each other.
Right. I think in the US, we would think immediately of technocracy in terms of like Palantir, this kind of world. I also think people use the word technocracy to mean more like scientific bureaus that are making decisions. And in that case, that whole part of the state sort of imploded in terms of the sense of it as nonpartisan during COVID. I mean, I think 2020 was a time where the entire technocratic apparatus of the US political state felt almost annexed by partisan politics on both sides.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you mentioned that because like scientific funding in the US is definitely not what it used to be, especially relative to federal funding. I mean, has during the peak of the Cold War, and I'm talking in the 1960s, there was so many federal grants given out to scientific institutions, and people like Daniel Bell and other thinkers during the 50s in post-war America legitimately, openly called themselves technocrats, or at the very least, they believed that they had reached a certain consensus that now the state could just run things scientifically. And obviously that imploded with the 1960s and social upheaval of the 60s. But there was a moment in America when it looked like the state was going to be run by technocrats, and it blew up in their face. But it's definitely, I think, less likely now, given that, well, not that it's less likely, but it definitely doesn't have any public approval. Like if you ask people, whether or not they like these tech elites or Silicon Valley, I mean, their approval rating for their project and what they're selling is really low. So they don't really have popular support.
What I wanted to think about too, how do you think anti-political technocrats relate to all of this?
Anti-politics gets conflated with populism all the time, but this mood in society of anti-political sentiment, right? One of the things that actually proves it's different than populism is that you have technocratic anti-politicians, right? So you have people like Barack Obama. He crusades against the old status quo in Washington when he's running for office. And yet his style of anti-politics is much closer to a kind of Jimmy Carter, good governance, we're going to fix the government through smart policy making type of thing.
I mean, that's something to talk about too.
Joe, who do you see as some of the other technocratic anti-politicians? In contrast, of course, to more populist anti-politicians like Donald Trump.
Emmanuel Macron, I think he would be an excellent. The president of France, the current one, he basically ran against the entire political establishment in France and detonated it. Those pictures, basically, he was going to reform and rejigger the French economy, which has been stagnant for a very long time. And without blowing up the, I guess, their social welfare compact.
So maintaining the social welfare state of France. And also his relationship to the parties was interesting, right?
he was the Minister of Economics, Industry, and Digital Affairs under Prime Minister Manuel Valls, who was a centrist socialist. And he was technically part of the Socialist Party in France. But he wound up running against that party as well as all the other old political parties in France.
He started
his own party, and they took over the French legislature and effectively detonated the entire old political setup, left, right, and center. Now,
Right.
how he's governed has been a little bit, well, it's been pretty tenuous, but he has tried to ram through this sort of technocratic reformism, but not necessarily in a way that actually has been friendly or gentle towards the social welfare state.
Well, that sort of gets at what anti-politics may give, it may take away quite disruptively. So Macron faces the yellow vests, that protest movement during his tenure. And I think that is kind of a result of a technocratic approach to climate change, if you think about it, right? Because the yellow vests, they ended up fighting for a lot of different things, like a minimum wage increase, which they got. But they were a movement in France that initially started because of a gas tax. Am I right?
Yeah.
So the yellow vests, in a sense, this kind of attempt to social engineer away climate change at that level through essentially an austerity measure that would disproportionately hurt farmers and working or middle class people, and not really big industry in the same way. That was sort of what got that backlash.
Right. It seems like a lot of what makes these technocrats unstuck, even if they play on anti-politics, even if they can be quite disruptive to the political system, is that they're still stuck with the idea of governing society. They're still stuck with the orientation of governing society and the real position of governing society.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I mean, I feel like most of the technocrats that have emerged in the last 10 years, pretty much none of them have reversed the trend of declining institutional trust. And that's pretty much come back to bite them. If you look at Obama, I mean, Obama sold himself as like a hope and change technocrat in a way. And the decline of institutional trust just continued to chip away through his entire 2 terms.
Right. It's interesting with Obama, too, because he didn't seem to lose personal popularity throughout his tenure. His job approvals kind of came and went. They spiked up a little bit towards the end of his presidency. But when he left office, the Democratic Party was in a profoundly weaker state than it had been when he entered office. And of course, we know what happened to the Republican Party. They got hijacked by Donald Trump.
I do think these technocratic elements are still present with Trumpism, though.
I think they're present with Trumpism, for sure.
In the state itself, like the way Trump organizes the state now, many of his allies I would classify as technocrats.
Early in his first term, he did tend to surround himself with generals, for instance.
Well, he mainly preoccupied himself with putting out fires within the state because he was really in a state of siege, I felt, in the first term. I do think that since he won the election more convincingly than 2016 this time around, so he definitely interpreted that as a mandate, and I think they're operating as if it's a mandate. I mean, they've said this publicly, the Trump administration.
Getting at like what you said too before, Grant, there is kind of a tendency, I think, in technocracy, even among anti-political technocrats, to wind up having to sort of save the political system, or to act like a savior of the political system that sort of unglues it, really.
Saving them from themselves.
Yeah, kind of. There's an element of that to Obama that kind of unstuck him a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's. I mean, it's interesting if you follow tech capital has become pretty much a dominant lobbying force in the United States. And if you follow just like politically where they've been, I mean, they didn't really coalesce around Trump until like the last year or so. Even in Trump's first term, it was very hostile. Like the would-be technocrats, the tech elite or whatever, were super hostile to Trump. And really, they made most of their money and their alliances during the Obama years. That's why Obama was like a natural technocrat away, and that he, not even that he was a technocrat in how he viewed society as much as he made an alliance with tech capital, and he, through his economic policies, really boosted them. Like they made their money during his term, basically.
I think too with Obama, actually, yeah, how did he view society really? I feel like Obama's pitch really was that, I think David Garrow's book actually gets at this to a large extent. He was trying to do Clintonism without the graft. And Clintonism itself was a technocratic term for the Democratic Party. You have expert decision making, but
Can you explain what you mean by graft? Like what?
I think for Obama, he disliked the sort of blatant influence peddling and money grubbing of the Clintons, which seems a little bit ironic now, given like he's basically positioned himself as a media influencer in his post-presidential tenure.
But he was trying to do something like Clintonism without the scandals.
I think this kind of became a problem for him, actually. Well, I think the thing too about Obamacare is that it actually hurt his popularity, because it did seem like a juggling of all the contradictions and special interests within the Democratic Party in a way that looks like a Clinton bill.
Right, like you have people essentially very sympathetic in the beginning to the sort of stated aim of expanding healthcare. But I mean, I remember at the time, the criticism was really
The backdoor dealing.
Yeah, the backdoor dealing was sort of the critique that Obamacare got at the time, and also the dilution of it from universal healthcare, public option, Obamacare.
The Clintons tried to do healthcare reform early in Bill Clinton's tenure. That was a disaster for them, actually. Clinton got wiped out in 94. The Democrats got wiped out in the 94 midterms, partially over this. Because again, it looked like it was a kind of a, I don't know, we'll get into that at some other episode, but something I think gets forgotten about too with Obamacare is that it was basically, something like Obamacare was basically the Republican pitch for healthcare before Obama took it up. Mitt Romney's healthcare reforms in Massachusetts were effectively the same thing. That's actually something that he got hammered on too during the 2012 election, because he had to basically rebuke governing plan of his. But I think that also even gets at like how the right-wing response to Obamacare is so oddly unhinged, because there was a drive to brand differentiate themselves from Obama.
Right, so Obamacare was criticized as the most socialist thing ever.
Right. And it was something that, and a lot of people called the Heritage Care, after the Heritage Foundation, the famous right-wing think tank.
I do think there are some things that remained popular. I remember some of the things around pre-existing conditions, or the parents being able to keep their children on their health care for slightly longer. I think those things had some resonance, but the actual Obamacare exchange itself was pretty muddled.
Yeah, for them wanting to be technocrats, they implemented it in a really shitty way. I mean, the website was I still remember the website was garbage, like slow, not loading, totally completely over budget, like outsourced to some company that I don't even, some political dealing. Like the whole thing was kind of like evidence that you couldn't really have like the technocratic desire to run things efficiently just came up like as an obstacle to politics like every single time.
In testing, healthcare.gov was unable to consistently handle 500 users at once.
Yeah, it was terrible. Like they couldn't even run, like as technocrats, they were shitty technocrats. It's too funny.
Before we move on, it was a Canadian company that made it too. One of the main contractors for the website was CGI Group, based in Montreal, Quebec, that was paid $93.7 million to help develop the healthcare.gov site, which was riddled with problems.
That's a sweet contract, man.
That's a lot of money. Damn.
I think too, like there is an inherent impotence to the state. But what allowed, I think, policymakers to break through special interests and implement agendas in the past was that they had social bases to relate to. That did give you the weight to put pressure against, competing factions.
I guess what I'm asking is like today's people who we would call the tech elite, they view themselves as a dominant force in shaping society. Now, is that true or false? Kind of an open question.
I wonder too, though, if that gives them a certain credit in the sense that technology has continued to advance and people who have a technocratic mentality, like we're using the word technocrat in a lot of different ways in this episode because there's a lot of different ways that it's used, and it's just going to happen. But maybe they're not as thoroughly anti-democratic in the sense that Howard Scott was, but technology continues to advance. And then you've got business people at the head of different tech companies who like to posture themselves as these geniuses. They sort of want to seem in charge of the government, but I mean, Zuckerberg is being forced to pony up a ton of money by the Trump administration. You've got a lot of these figures are not necessarily actually in the driver's seat as much as they want you to think, in my opinion. They are very at the behest of their regulators. Biden got them to censor things, and they're going to probably do what Trump wants them to do too.
The funny part is becoming this politicized and this close to government. I think ironically, it actually is going to result in a fatal loss of authority for them. At least in terms of public draw. Do you think that getting into government helped Elon Musk? Like, does he look more credible now, or do you think he looks like a joke now?
Yeah, it definitely eroded his credibility. But this is why I think, like, I don't really think today's, let's call them Silicon Valley tech elites or whatever you want to call them, I don't think they're not, if you ask them, I'm not entirely sure they would even agree with a lot of the original technocratic ideas. But the way they operate, like, for example, I was reading an essay. Peter Thiel is like a classic example, I think, of what would be a technocrat today. And he has written op-eds stretching far back from 2009, essentially talking about how politics and technological change have become incompatible. Like politics is strangling technological change. And others that are in his camp, like the author of The Network State, Balaji Srinivasan, who I mentioned in my piece, actually. I mean, his whole MO is that politics has strangled tech elites so much and tech capital so much that they need to flee and establish their own sovereign territories. And essentially, he proposes like that people who believe in the future of tech and the venture capitalists, that they need to essentially exit. And then once they grow so large on the margins, they can come back and reassert their power. And this, had standing ovation at Y Combinator and places like that. So there definitely is a contingent of tech capital that's very frustrated with politics. And that's why Elon entering politics was so shocking, because it was you're not supposed to do that kind of thing,
I mean, it's such a fantasy that they're going to form their own state. Even propping up AI right now, there's a certain level of geopolitical oriented persuasion. There's a lot of, if you don't invest in this, China's going to get ahead of us in this arms race type of thing. So they have to really go to the state and sort of beg for alms.
A lot of old companies like Oracle have refashioned themselves as like emergent AI companies. And it makes you wonder like how much of this is a bubble. I mean, the issue is that they're using a lot of paper profits to enact real material change. So for example, like I think Larry Ellison became the richest man in the world briefly recently. And it's all paper, like it's all like on paper, you know, it's just the valuation of Oracle went up. But it's with that paper valuation that now he's able to push for acquiring Warner Brothers and these other, like, you know, TikTok and stuff like that. So it's having like real ramifications on, like it's going to have real consequences for the entire economy. And everything's like wrapped up in the bubble. So I'm not entirely convinced that it's like too big to fail or something. If it does like go south, like there's going to be a lot of collateral damage.
Thank you for watching the Rabble Report.